Perfect. All right. Thank you. I'm William May with the Department of Planning and Development, the Zoning Administration Division. I'm joined here today also with Kathy Belgian of the Zoning Evaluation Division. Today we are here to present a brief update on a potential amendment related to the PRC plans and minor modifications. A detailed white paper was posted on a dedicated web page for this amendment, and a link to the website is in the chat. As a reminder, with the readoption of the zoning ordinance in 2023, the board directed staff to review the PRC plan exceptions, particularly as related to community facilities and open space. Last November, we provided a white paper and some proposed text, and since then we've been doing some outreach into the community. So this amendment is again focused largely on when a PRC plan would not be required when requesting minor revisions on a site. For history, in 1962, the PRC district was created. It was the first planned district in Fairfax County. The communities of Reston, Burke, and Cardinal Forest are the only 3 PRC districts in the county. So when a site is zoned to PRC, a development plan is approved by the board. A PRC plan is required, similar to final development plans, that provide additional detail. Prior to 2007, the Department of Public Works and Environmental Services approved these PRC plans administratively. In 2007, the board made the PRC plan a legislative process since many PRC developments were not subject to proffers and the development plans were not specific with respect to the number of units, layouts, amongst other things. Given that redevelopment could occur in unanticipated locations without a public forum due to the blob nature of these approved development plans, the board amended the zoning orders to change the process for an administrative approval to a legislative approval with public hearings. When a PRC plan was changed, there was no update to provisions to when a PRC plan was exempt. The current provisions largely mirror those provisions dating back to 1994 with minor revisions. So the zoning ordinance lists out when a PRC plan would not be approved, and that's a summary of those is on the slide here. So a PRC district, again, could be, a PRC plan may not be required for minor provisions if they meet these requirements, or they could also ask for minor modification. Originally, what staff had proposed was eliminating conditions 3, 4, and 5 and require them to meet the minor modification provisions. So a minor modification is an administrative approval that's reviewed by a zoning evaluation division. That's why Kathy's here today to talk about that in accordance with visions of the zoning ordinance. These applications are also coordinated with the district supervisor and require formal submission to staff. As I said, we've since made some revisions to this proposal. So the first one relates to PRC plan exceptions for for building additions. So currently PRC plans permit a building addition of the lesser of 10% or 2,000 square feet, where a minor modification permits greater of 500 square feet or 5%. And what staff looked at was bringing these two building additions together and only use the minor modification provisions related to non-residential uses and multifamily. In addition, PRC plans for non-structural elements such as increase in parking area, changes to transition screening and loading was exempt. We're looking to retain the ability to allow for a small increase in parking spaces without a PRC plan, whereas changes to open space, changes to transitional screening, setbacks would use the same provisions as a minor modification and would be directed to use that process. Again, these would be focused on non-residential uses, multifamily uses through the process. The biggest change we're proposing to make relates to community recreation space. Now, this is areas that is typically managed by a homeowners association, condominium association, or a property members association. And we're looking at it to create a separate process from the minor modifications and would be continued through the PRC plan exceptions. So it would allow for small reductions of yards, changes to landscaping, open space, would also allow for a one-time new building of 2,000 square feet on the development plan area, as well as additions to existing buildings, a one-time addition of the existing buildings up to 2,000 square feet. In addition, we would continue to permit minor improvements such as benches, bus shelters, playground equipment, and pedestrian lighting. We're making one change that would be impactful outside the PRC district, and that's related to minor modifications for active rec facilities. And the proposed changes is slightly changed from what we presented in November. Will allow for change out active rec with an active rec with similar recreational opportunities and impacts. As I mentioned, we have a dedicated web page. The web page information is here. A copy of the detailed white paper, the proposed language that's being circulated right now for comment, as well as my contact information is available. And with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions. I'm going to stop sharing right now.
Hey, Bill, I just had one on that last slide.
Sure.
I'll use my words first, which is one recreation activity to another, kind of an exchange. Are the same square footage elements that are in the previous slides relevant to that one too, or would it not matter as long as it was recreation to recreation? Does that make sense?
So, well, like Kathy talked about what questions. So yes, we'd be looking at something similar in size. Wouldn't be necessarily the same size. Could be bigger potentially. I think it's going to be really kind of the impact. Maybe some examples we might have is you have a sports court that you're moving into more. Maybe a basketball court goes to a sports court. It's a similar recreational opportunity, similar recreational impact. I'm not sure what other things you may have seen in the past, Kathy, because this is something we've sort of done with similar type of rec facilities in the past.
We've had requests. I can give you an example of what doesn't work. We've had requests for taking an active recreation facility like a tennis court, and they were asking to convert it to more of a passive recreation area with seating and a fire pit. And we weren't, because that's not kind of the same category of recreation, we weren't able to do that. But then they went ahead and added like a shuffleboard court and some, cornhole lanes. And we were able to, say that was a back to a similarly active form of recreation.
Active recreation.
So yeah. Now, in terms of size differences, if you're looking to replace something with something bigger, it's going to fall back into all the other criteria of how much additional, are we falling into area that was previously supposed to be undisturbed, and how much, and all that kind of, those kind of questions that would come up with any expansion on a property. So.
Right. And I mean, the square footage is largely related to structures. So thinking of structures in community spaces, might be pavilions, or you've talked about in the past, concession stands, or bathhouses, ability to expand those facilities is really what we were trying to get to in the structure square footage, where the active rec to active rec is really more the use, I would say, as opposed to square footage.
The use type, yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Sure.
So when you say like one-time use or one-time exception for a new building up to 2,000 square feet,
Right.
Is it or is it or the addition to a building of 2,000 feet? Like, could you do both?
Yes. So we would want, so if you have a development plan, we're really focusing on a development plan area. So you get one new building on that development plan area. Now you have existing buildings. Those existing buildings could also get a one-time addition. So when one of the questions that came out was avoiding serial additions. I was like, wow, this year I get 2,000 square feet, and I'll ask again for another 2,000 square feet in 2 years. So we would not do that. But you could do one brand new building and additions to existing buildings.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
So I have a question on 6B.
Sure.
Of the new proposed text.
Yep.
It speaks to recreational, but 6B has the word yards in it. I don't understand how that, like, I understand that in the context of residential, but what does that really mean in the context of a recreational facility?
Well, you'd still typically, a recreation facility would have a setback to property lines. So it's really trying to get the impact of, you have an existing recreation facility, you want to make changes, you want to keep the context to the adjacent property the same. So we allow for changes to setbacks or distances to adjacent properties, but within that 10%. So it could
Right,
go.
So even if there's a recreational use that doesn't have a noticeable structure associated with it, like you're thinking of something surrounded by a fence, like a tennis court versus not, like perhaps a soccer field, is that kind of your question? I mean, it's similar, like Bill said, it's still a use, and its proximity to the, to the property line is still something we would look at. If you're taking one and moving it significantly closer than it was before to the property line, then we would want to take a look at that in terms of impacts and how much closer it got.
Right, but okay, so you're saying that you would take a look at it, but I'm just not typically used to setback requirements in the PRC on recreational properties. So that's, am I not?
Well,
Right.
there's
Is that
not
not
there's not one upon initially establishing it other than whatever gets approved. But then if you're making a change to that administratively, then we take a look at the difference between what was approved and constructed versus what you're trying to change it to. So it's not that there's a black and white setback requirement per se, but there is the approval, whatever was shown on a development plan or PRC plan was shown at something. And so doing it administratively would require it not being too significant of a departure from that in terms of additional impacts or reduced setbacks. So.
I guess I would just it's not clear from our perspective what that really means, because we don't speak in yards on recreational spaces but I understand what you're saying is you would, I guess, be looking at the as-built recreational facility and trying to compare that to what the requested change was and trying to see if there was an impact to the adjacent property. I understand that.
Right.
But since there's no setback really on these facilities to begin with, it's okay, hard to understand. It's just clear.
It's confusing. The word setback implies an exact limitation, whereas we're just using it to say the distance it is set back from the property line. So
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's what was confusing. So
Sure.
if there's any clarification you could make on that, because it was I was like, the yards, we don't have yards in recreational facilities in the PRC. And then on 6E, we were wondering if things like accessories to pools, like we had put in RA had put in its suggestion, things like slides, additions to pools, things like that are still not included in here. Is there a reason for that? I know you don't want to do a long laundry list. We heard that when you came to speak to the RA board. But things like that are pretty standard equipment for, and I'd love to be able to get some clarification to know upfront whether if we added slides to our pools, is that something you would be considering a minor accessory structure?
So I think generally when we've seen pools in the past, so if you're kind of working in the confines of the pool decking and you're adding in, a lot of times we see maybe the whether it be slides or other type of equipment within there. Shade structures. I don't see that being an issue that would fall under the minor accessory structures, minor improvements that we would permit under E. When we are more concerned would be, is the pool doubling in size as opposed to we're changing what happens within the footprint of the pool, the larger pool area. A lot of times, again, Kathy probably sees more on the minor modifications where, it may change make the bathhouse bigger or make some
Or
of the
expanding the deck area, right? The water hole stays the same, but you're making a bigger deck where there was just grass before, stuff like that.
Any clarification you guys could make to that would be helpful because it is such a kind of standard thing that you would put in a pool. And those are a lot of the recreational facilities that RA has. And then I wanted, and I'm sorry I didn't clarify this before, but to Mike Reynolds and Natalie, have you guys asked the other questions related that that we got from a board member, or can I?
We have
assume
a
you've asked
meeting later
those,
on
or
today.
okay.
Yeah, I don't know that we would ask that on.
We're going to be able to
public
have
meeting.
some separate time, Jennifer, but we can bring some of those up now for the recording if you'd like.
Yeah, I mean, because some of the other minor things are like hot tubs or spas, those, multi-use courts. We're trying to figure out if those would be in that 6E category or not.
Also, a bubble, Bill, and Kathy, like a bubble. Not that we have anything
Over
on
our
the boards now, but
facility.
yeah, for heating, which would be not changing anything in terms of the use or the site, but it's a more visual thing, obviously.
Yeah.
What is it again?
Like a tent bubble, so we could swim off season.
Like making it into an indoor
Tennis bubble.
facility. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's a pretty big difference. I'm not sure that that's something that we would typically be comfortable adding on an administrative scale. I don't know if Bill or Leslie, if you had thoughts on that. But I think unless something was specified,
as one new structure.
Right. Unless something was specified in the, in the original approval that it would have a seasonal bubble or something, because that does, in a sense, extend the season. You could argue that intensifies the, the functionality of the use and makes it usable for more of the year than was previously anticipated, in addition to being a structure and a big visual difference. So
you're thinking bubbles for pools, tennis courts? Is that?
Yeah.
Is that what you've been hearing?
That's a question that was a question posed to us as staff, as Director Juszczyk is talking about.
And how big would it?
Yeah, and we were thinking that it might fall under number 8 on your list, but we have some examples of ones we've had drawn up in the past that we can certainly give you a new but just to give you an idea of what we're describing, and if you guys could give some guidance as to whether that is included in your language changes or wouldn't be included, that would be helpful.
I think we have in the past, a long time ago. I mean, we've made determinations that you add a bubble, it's a development plan amendment or a PRC plan amendment, or it's a process. It's not it's not a by right kind of thing that you can just do.
Okay. And it wouldn't be considered
I know
minor.
it may have been unrelated to a Reston pool, but I thought there was.
I think we did one in the past that was a Reston pool, Leslie, when I was in ZAD. So
yeah. And I also think there was similarly with like tennis courts.
Yes, both for pools and tennis courts is what we'd be looking at. Yes.
It would be safe to say that if that is something that you are going to propose, that would, I'm saying 99% require, some type of a process, legislative process.
And that's where we're trying to figure out like where the line is. That's why we're throwing out a lot of examples.
Right.
Yeah, that's definitely on that side of the line for that.
And as you know, part of the proposal that we're putting together is we're reducing the cost to do an interpretation, by a lot. I mean, it wasn't big to begin with. So, there is incentive to, if there is that question, it may be appropriate to send the letter in. If there's kind of a question, and we may not be able to give you a response without really looking into it and doing research. So that was one reason why we reduced the fee. Bill, I don't remember, what did we reduce it? I think you put it in it's in
At
the
half
presentation.
was the proposal with the ability to go
Yes.
less if the board wanted to.
You said
Right.
half.
Now, I know,
so
you guys,
620
it's
would be
still a
310.
cost, but
Yeah.
it's a lot less than, what it would take to file it. So,
Yeah,
Right.
that's this page
Yeah.
here that you're talking about.
And
Yeah.
yeah, and I'll be honest, the county fees are not necessarily the fees that we're really worried about. It's that we have a lot of these blob plans that would actually need to be drawn up, and going through the expense of having engineering draw them up, when we know that whether they'd have to go through the whole process or be minor, is where the expense really is. It's the engineering and legal fees that get us there, more than Fairfax County fees. Although we are, very thankful that you guys took that into consideration when you're making these changes. So those were all of my requests or my questions. I don't know if anyone else had any others.
I had just one more that sort of relates to this conversation, and this may be kind of seemingly unclear too, but it's hard for us. So we get to Jennifer's point about the costs of hiring a consulting firm, right? If we had to do a full PRC plan, that's a large multi-month process. The minor modification process, is that defined anywhere, that or is there an actual application that we can look at? Because one of the tests that we get asked is, how much would the minor modification process cost? And it's just hard for us to judge that, I guess. It may be that it's one off. We don't know until we start talking to you or the administrator.
Right. In terms of you being able to estimate the cost, that's harder for me to answer, because that's not, other than our fee, what information we need. There's not a set requirement, other than you have to tell us what you're asking and, show us what you're trying to ask for. Basically the cost of preparing the materials is going to be dependent on the extent of what it is you're asking for. Now, if you've got a blob plan, you're going to show us a blob plan. You're going to show us the, whatever approval plan that got it built, be that the building permit plat or the as-built or whatever you have, and,
Right.
going to show an outline of what you're doing that's different. Depending on what it is, we may ask for additional information. I know John Farrell was always worried about things like traffic studies and whatever, but if you're not messing with parking and circulation, we don't care about that. We're not asking for any of that. But when you're adding a building addition, depending on the age of the property and what other stormwater facilities, we will have the county staff look at it. And if there are concerns, they may ask for, hey, how are you going to mitigate additional impervious surface? So there may be some expenditure, on your end, but you would have to do that to meet the requirements at the next phase of the site plan anyway. So it's
Right.
almost like you would just be doing it slightly earlier in order to get through that
But we
part of the
wouldn't-
process.
but Kathy, we wouldn't ask for engineered drawings, would we?
Not engineered, no. So we just need enough to compare to the approval and to understand, the visual and other impacts of what you're doing. And we send it to the county's, subject matter experts. So if you're taking down trees, we're going to have urban foresters look at it. And, if you're adding to a building and there was any kind of proffer about the architecture, I know you all have your own review processes for that, but we would also want to see what it looked like. So presumably you're going to have an idea of what it's going to look like too. So it shouldn't be like coming up with a new graphic because you didn't have one before. It's just showing us what you've been working on, that sort of thing. So, yeah, it's not a set, it's not as specific of a submission requirement as for the bigger application processes. We don't require X type of plan with X things shown on it, but generally we need to see enough information to make an assessment. And if your development plans were newer than blob plans and more detailed, we usually are looking to see an overlay on the new, on the development plan detail if one was done. So.
Great, that's helpful. Thank you.
I had a question from a member the other day who wanted to donate a gaga ball pit to the association. And
what kind of
Gaga ball?
It's this big circle thing, I guess, that kids play in, and they have a
Oh.
ball that goes. It's like a big circle thing.
My church had one of those, and they just put it in the parking lot and moved it out of the parking lot when they were done.
Well, they were asking to build one on RA property, and obviously, we don't have an active recreation facility on some of our property, and they were saying, well, and my first question had to be, instead of, oh, that sounds great, and I think that that's kind of minor, my first question had to be are we going to have to go through a long process and like have it designed, have it engineered and show, the lines between the adjacent properties and I couldn't answer that question. And so it just disincentivizes sometimes when those lines are not clear.
Well,
How
Bill,
far a
didn't we
board is
answer that?
willing to go into it. And so,
The question
I
we would
had
have,
Peter
obviously,
submit it.
is where would it be? I mean, a gaga ball pit, I mean, I'm very familiar with it. I mean, I would fall under the playground equipment. So if it's an area that's shown an existing playground, great. If it's an area that's shown as preserved woodland, probably not so great. It's really a question of where, and I don't think we have an answer of where it was necessarily going to go. But if you're in a developed recreation area, and adding a gaga ball pit to me is the same as adding a swing set.
Right. If you're adding it to an existing park that has
Right.
other stuff, that's probably going to be less of an issue.
Which
Right.
is which we could probably answer with a phone call.
Right.
It was just the question of where it would be at was the only question.
So we need some information, but that's,
Right.
we want to have that relationship
Mm-hmm.
with you and any other HOA. It's not limited just to the PRC.
No, absolutely. And that's why we're asking the questions that we're asking, because we're trying to figure out that line, because a board is not going to take on something necessarily that they know is going to cost us, a 2-year process and, a couple $1 million. They might decide to limit that scope much earlier in the process.
Right.
Right.
And I think,
and that's where we're trying to figure out where the
right.
line
And so
is.
having dialogue, with staff, just to have a discussion, not even submitting, that's, we can kind of give you some of the ins and outs. We can tell you that, while this isn't official, this is kind of where we're thinking it would land. And that gives you a little bit more, guidance as to how far you want to go, right?
Yep. And that's why we asked for what we asked for to begin with, is to figure out a little bit more clearly where that line was up front. So we appreciate all the time and effort you guys have taken into considering how we're just a little bit different than a typical developer in the PRC.
Right. That's why we try to carve out a separate one for community rec facilities.
Yeah, I love that change this time.
Right.
It was very, very welcome. Thank you.
And, like I said before, we plan on coming back to I think it's the May 8th meeting, if I remember correctly. Hopefully you'll put us at the beginning of the schedule again. But we can come back, and certainly in the meantime, we're going to meet with staff later today.
Wonderful.
We have another one of these meetings this afternoon to see if there's any other input. We have a tentative meeting set up with Burke Conservancy and see if they have any input. So, we have a goal to bring it, get it authorized before the recess, but we want to finish up this, see if there's any other changes we want to make before we take it to board authorization. So that's what obviously today is, and upcoming meetings. So, beyond the question, if you have also specific language suggestions, we're happy to consider those too.
Okay. Thanks a bunch.
Yep.
Thanks for the time today.
Anything else, anyone? Okay. Well, thank you.
Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
You too.